continue our series on the interurban cars that ran between Detroit and Port Huron. We kind of understand why people from Port Huron would want to go to the big city for the shopping and, of course, sometimes for medical reasons for more experienced doctors and hospitals. But why would people want to leave Detroit for Port Huron? Well, they wanted to leave mainly in the summertime, and that was because of the heat. The heat was unbearable in the big cities. Every time the temperature went up, people died, as you can see from this news article here. For the people that couldn't afford to leave the city, they escaped the city by taking the ferry over to Belle Isle. They could enjoy the cool summer breezes and the ride over, and then of course when they got to Belle Isle it was cooler over there, and they would sometimes, if they had the money, take a canoe and rent a canoe and go paddling around the island. The folks that had the means escaped the city by using the interurban, by going up along the water or the shoreline to Port Huron, or stops in between Detroit and Port Huron. And for a while this was the most economical way to make that trip, at least until the price of the excursion boats came down. For a while in the late 1800s it was quite pricey to take a trip like that. But in the early 1900s it was cheaper. You can see in this photo that from Detroit to Port Huron round trip was $1.50 on the interurban. And you can see in this photo of the prices for the White Star Line going from Detroit to Port Huron round trip, it was $1.50. So when it's 90 degrees in the shade, what would you rather do? Would you rather be in a streetcar for hours, or would you rather be on a steamer, enjoying the cool breezes that went across the lake and the rivers, sitting out there and be able to walk around and looking over the railing, and maybe have something to eat, or perhaps dancing? Everything was available on those steamers. And it was a downfall of the interurban. It really hurt their business. But that's a whole other story. The story we want to look at today is just taking a ride from Detroit to Port Huron and seeing some of the stops that are involved along the way and what they looked like back then. As we said before, no matter which route you took, whether the lakeshore route or the more direct route down Gratiot, you're going to end up in Mount Clemens. So that's the first stop that we want to look at. And it brings us to the second reason that people went north from Detroit, the mineral bath. Mount Clemens was very famous for their mineral baths, not only in the state of Michigan, but worldwide. The rich and famous regularly traveled by private rail car more than 100 years ago to Mount Clemens. It was called America's Bath City, and it offered luxury resort hotels with heated baths, which were widely known to relieve arthritis, rheumatism pain, as well as skin problems, and many other things that folks wanted to take care of. Thousands of polio patients were also drawn to the waters. And legend had it that people came to the city in wheelchairs and left walking under their own power. Among regular visitors to Mount Clemens baths were Henry Ford, William Randolph Hearst, Mae West, Babe Ruth, and European royalty. Like so many other things, the curative powers of mineral water were discovered accidentally. The first well Mount Clemens was drilled in 1862 in hoping to strike oil, but found only brine, and the well was abandoned. And then the Mount Clemens Salt Company was formed, and the drilling began again, and they began to get the salt brine out of there, and they used that for several years. But then they had too many different types of minerals in it to be pure, and so they stopped again. And they stopped bringing up the brine from there, and it started to pool around that area. And at this point, an old lame horse and a man named Dor Kellogg entered the story. Legend has it that a farmer turned the horse out to die. The horse sought the shade of the abandoned tank of the old salt mine and stamped out a small basin that collected the dripping mineral water. After repeated exposure to this water, the horse was rejuvenated. Actually, the discovery of the curative powers of mineral waters at this well was probably made by Dor Kellogg, He came to Mount Clemens to operate a milling firm. He had a bad case of eczema, and remembering the beneficial effects of the sea voyage, he asked permission to use the mineral water. And long story short, that's where it began. It cured him of what he had, and other people found out about it, and they were cured. And this here is the very first bathhouse they built in Mount Clemens. This burned down in 1873, and they rebuilt it, and it looked like this. And then after 1900, the bath industry just took off in Mount Clemens. It seemed like there was a bathhouse or hotel in every block. Too many pictures to even show you. We'll show you some of the bigger bathhouses that there were in Mount Clemens. This is the Agnew Hotel. You can see the interurban car right alongside of it, where they let the folks off. Here's a much better picture of it. You can see these are grand hotels. This one here is the Fountain Hotel, and I especially enjoy the architecture of this particular building. We see 1, 2, 3, 4 stories, and I could show you probably 15 more pictures of bathhouses in Mount Clemens. There's that many of them. But we're not here to look at Mount Clemens. This is a video series on Port Huron, so why are we looking at these? Well, the reason is I want you to see what the competition was for Port Huron as a tourist destination. It really couldn't compete that much on the mineral bath scale because of Mount Clemens and other places before they ever got to Port Huron. And on the other one, I wanted you to see there were other grand hotels and resorts that you could go to besides Port Huron. And yet Port Huron still did all right. But I wanted to show you what the competition was. That's the reason for this video today. And to get an idea what a trip from Detroit to Port Huron would look like back then. You can see why it took so long for the interurban to get from Detroit to Port Huron. Just look at the number of stops on this rapid railway ticket stub here. You can see Mount Clemens in about the middle there on the left side, and of course you got not only the stops of the town, but you had stops within the town. And when you got to Port Huron, you saw that there were stops within Port Huron as well. You can see toward the bottom, after Marysville, was the Salt Company, Bunn's Creek and Ravenswood, Moke Street, 16th Street, the Dry Dock, and Port Huron finally. And to make sure you got on in the right interurban car, most of the time, but not all the time, they had the major cities that you were going to. Not all the stops, but the cities. For example, you can see here in this photograph, Mount Clemens, New Baltimore, Anchorville, Fairhaven, Pearl Beach, Algonac, Marine City, St. Clair, and Port Huron. But what wasn't on there was the 40 or 50 other stops that they made. After a couple of stops, you came to the city of New Baltimore. And here we see the interurban just outside the interurban depot in New Baltimore, along with a horse and carriage. This gives you some idea of what the city looked like around the turn of the century. And this shot, you can see the interurban just sneaking around the corner there. Of course, all the small cities in between Mount Clemens and Port Huron wanted to have some piece of the action from Detroit, and so most of them had a hotel that they would advertise on the water or with water view or a dock for fishing, whatever it might be. And New Baltimore was no different. They advertised their hotels as well. In this photo here, we see the large powerhouse in New Baltimore that supplied all the power for the complete line of rapid railway. Interurban car motors ran off of DC electricity. And of course, the original electricity plan for the interurban is that they supplied only DC electricity to these motors. And it was a very inefficient way to do it because they lost so much power along the line. And so they would have to have substations or more power stations along the way in order to power them. In this station here, in the New Baltimore station, they went with a completely different system. They went with an AC system. The AC didn't lose the power like the DC lines did, but they did have to have something to convert those lines to DC. And so there was those substations we talked about. Instead of power stations, they became transformers, and they transformed the AC to DC, and it became a very efficient way to run the interurban system. This is a photograph of the inside in the engine room. You can see it had three Westinghouse tandem compound engines, and these are directly connected to three Westinghouse three-phase alternating current generators. So it took up a lot of space. The lines that ran from this powerhouse were considered high-tension lines, and its challenges when they came to the river, and St. Clair especially. In St. Clair, it was necessary to cross Pine River, which large vessels pass through, having masts sometimes more than 120 feet high. Rather than put submarine cable under the river for the high tension current, two poles were erected, one on each side of the river, each 150 feet high and about 220 feet apart, and the wires were carried on those poles. Around the powerhouse in New Baltimore, Rapid Railway maintained a beautiful park. I found this photo of it when I was going through looking for research on this, and this is what it says. Surrounding our powerhouse at New Baltimore is Milton Park, one of the prettiest spots in this section of the country. It is maintained by this company for the benefit of our patrons of Rapid Railway and the citizens of New Baltimore, and all who visit the park are highly appreciative of the privileges extended. The park is named after Stephen Meldrum, a veteran employee of the powerhouse. The above picture shows a section of the park with a fountain of odd design in the foreground. Beautiful flower beds and bushes and shrubbery, along with pretty winding walks, make the park an attractive spot for a day's outing. Two fine tennis courts are also maintained in the park, and the company supplies balls, rackets, and nets. Who would have thought that a company would provide something like that? I think that would have been something to see. Stop we want to look at next is Anchorville, and this wasn't much competition for Port Huron, that was for sure. But there was a couple of stops they made here, this one and then this one here. They didn't have much in the way of hotels, but they did have places like this place here, which is more like a big boarding house than a hotel. And then they also, of course, had cottages that they could rent out to the tourists. And then they also, of course, had good fishing. A little further down the line, we come to Fairhaven. And of course, Fairhaven didn't have a lot there. These are all small towns that the interurban was going through. But they did have cottages in Fairhaven, as you can see a picture here of them. And this was their main tourist attraction. We do have a picture of the stop they made in Pearl Beach, and that's this photograph right here. This is where Johnny Lake's Tavern and Restaurant is today. But back then it was the N.G. Aspinator store. You can see the same store in this photograph right here. In the background, if you look carefully, you can see the interurban car stopping at the store. Next stop we want to look at is Algonac. And here you can see it probably in the late 1800s. Algonac didn't pose much of a serious competition to the tourist industry of Port Huron, unless you wanted to buy a boat, that is. And then, of course, you probably wanted to go to this fella here, Chris Smith. Chris Smith built his first wooden boat in 1874 at the age of 13. Years later, he built a duck hunting boat. His friend liked the way he built them, and they asked him to build them one. And this was technically the start of the Chris Craft Boat Company. The name Chris Craft came from the name watercrafts, what ran on the water. And of course, these boats were made by Chris Smith, and so they were called Chris's Crafts, or they shortened it up, Chris Craft. It later became a complex like this. This was taken around the 30s, so the folks on the interurban wouldn't have been able to see this. However, if they were lucky, they did get to see this. This was the Tajmu, and we saw other lake steamers as well, docked at Algonac, and was quite close to the interurban track. Our next stop is Marine City that we want to look at. And this is a great picture because it shows the interurban coming right down the main street. You see the tracks going right down the center. And here's another great picture showing it going through town. And you can also see the Lewis Craft dry goods store. The main competition to Port Huron and Marine City was the Colonial Hotel and Mineral Baths. And here you can see a picture of the hotel along with the interurban going right in front of it, which was probably a stop for it as well. And not only that, but it says here that positively the finest, best mineral baths on the face of the earth, not in the state of Michigan, not in the United States, but on the face of the earth. Quite impressive. But the Colonial Hotel and Mineral Baths didn't really create a threat to the Port Huron tourist industry. The real threat came at our next stop, Clair Springs. In our next video, we'll look at one of the finest and largest hotels in America. And you'll be able to see why some folks never went any further than Clair Springs. They never got as far as Port Huron. We have some great pictures to share with you, both inside and outside the hotel. We'll spend some time there. I think you'll enjoy it.